Imagine for a moment that you are the most powerful commander in the known world, conqueror of territories stretching from Greece to India, responsible for an empire spanning 3 continents. Now imagine that, in a single day, your own soldiers, those who have fought alongside you for more than a decade, turn against you in a revolt that threatens to destroy everything you've worked for. This is not fiction. This is the true story of Alexander the Great and the day his empire nearly collapsed in the city of Opis in 324 BC. If you're curious to discover how the greatest conqueror in ancient history faced his greatest internal crisis, subscribe to the channel and leave a comment letting us know what time you're watching this video. Together, let's uncover one of the most dramatic and least known episodes in Alexander's life. It was the summer of 324 BC when Alexander returned from his campaigns in India to the ancient Babylonian city of Opis, located on the banks of the Tigris River in present-day Iraq. The young Macedonian king, who had left his homeland 13 years earlier with only 35,000 men, now commanded an empire spanning more than 5 million square kilometers. His conquests had created the largest contiguous empire the world had ever seen, connecting cultures, languages, and traditions from the Mediterranean to the Indian subcontinent. But success came at a price. The Macedonian soldiers, who had followed Alexander through scorching deserts, icy mountains, and Rhine forests, were exhausted. Many had spent more than half their lives away from home, fighting battles in foreign lands whose names they could barely pronounce. They had seen comrades die on distant battlefields and had endured hunger, thirst, disease, and wounds that would scar them forever. Alexander, on the other hand, seemed to have changed dramatically since the beginning of his campaigns. The young king, who once consulted his veteran generals, now made unilateral decisions. He had adopted Persian customs, including the protocol of proskynesis, a form of bowing that required subjects to prostrate themselves before him, something completely alien to Macedonian tradition. His political marriages with Persian princesses, and his insistence on integrating Persian and other nationalities into his ranks, had created growing tension among his native troops. When Alexander arrived at Opis that fateful summer, he carried with him ambitious plans for the future of his empire. He dreamed of new campaigns in Arabia, perhaps even westward to Italy and beyond. But first, he needed to restructure his army. The decision he was about to announce would forever change his relationship with his most loyal soldiers and nearly destroy everything he had fought for. The city of Opis was a strategic location, a former Persian administrative center that Alexander had transformed into one of his operational bases. It was here that he planned to implement a series of reforms that would solidify his control over the vast empire. But among all these reforms, one specific decision would prove explosive. Alexander announced that he planned to discharge his older and wounded Macedonian veterans, sending them back home with generous rewards, while replacing them with Persian soldiers trained in the Macedonian manner. For Alexander, this was a logical and necessary decision. His veterans had served honorably, but many were physically worn out from long campaigns. Furthermore, integrating Persian soldiers into his army was not just a practical matter, but part of his larger vision of creating a truly cosmopolitan empire where Macedonians, Greeks, Persians, and other nationalities could coexist and collaborate. He had observed the effectiveness of Persian soldiers when properly trained and equipped, and believed they could serve with the same loyalty as their Macedonian compatriots. However, for the Macedonian soldiers, this decision represented something far more sinister. They interpreted the dismissal not as a reward for years of loyal service, but as a rejection. Worse still, the replacement by Persian soldiers seemed to confirm their worst fears, that Alexander had become more Persian than Macedonian, more interested in his new subjects than in those who had followed him from the beginning. Tensions had been mounting for months. The soldiers had murmured about Alexander's changing behavior, his adoption of Persian customs, his marriages to foreign women, his apparent preference for Persian advisors over his veteran Macedonian generals. Many felt that the young king they had followed across the Hellespont had disappeared, replaced by an Eastern despot who viewed them as disposable. When Alexander called a general assembly at Opis to announce his decisions, he expected gratitude from his veterans. After all, he was offering them the opportunity to return home as wealthy heroes, with enough resources to live comfortably for the rest of their lives. He had prepared speeches about honor, loyalty, and the glories they had achieved together. But what happened at that assembly was something Alexander had never experienced in his entire military career. The soldiers didn't greet the announcement with applause or gratitude. Instead, a low, menacing murmur began to spread through the ranks. Isolated voices became choruses, and the choruses turned into shouts of protest. The Macedonian veterans didn't want to be dismissed, they didn't want to be replaced by Persians, and they didn't want their king to continue his campaigns without them. What began as verbal protests quickly escalated into something much more serious. Soldiers began throwing their weapons to the ground, a symbolic gesture of rejection of Alexander's authority. Others began shouting insults, questioning not only the king's recent decisions, but also his very legitimacy as a leader. Some even challenged Alexander to continue his campaigns solely with his new Persian allies, since he apparently no longer needed his Macedonian soldiers. For Alexander, who had faced fierce enemies on battlefields across the known world, this rebellion of his own men represented something far more dangerous than any enemy army. A conqueror could survive a military defeat, but a leader rarely survives the loss of the loyalty of his own troops. The mutiny at Opis was not just a matter of military discipline. It was an existential crisis that threatened the very foundation of his power. The exact details of what happened during the first hours of the mutiny are partially lost to history, but we know that the situation quickly spiraled out of control. Soldiers who had followed Alexander through impossible campaigns now openly defied him. Veteran officers who had been promoted through the ranks on their own merits now questioned every decision he had made in recent years. The very air in Opis seemed charged with betrayal and revolt. Alexander, however, was not a man who backed down easily from a challenge. His initial response to the mutiny was characteristic of his impetuous personality and his refusal to show weakness. Rather than trying to calm the mutinous soldiers with concessions or negotiations, he chose a much riskier and more dramatic approach. Historical sources suggest that Alexander, accompanied only by his closest bodyguards, personally descended into the midst of the crowd of revolting soldiers. This was an extraordinary display of personal courage, but also of shrewd political calculation. He knew that his physical presence would force the soldiers to directly confront not only his policies, but himself as a person and as a king. The ensuing confrontation was intense and emotional. Alexander did not try to appease his soldiers with empty promises or political compromises. Instead, he confronted them with a mixture of anger, disappointment, and defiance that took many by surprise. He reminded them of all the victories they had won together, all the riches they had gained, all the glories they had shared. But he also made it clear that he would not tolerate insubordination or disloyalty. One of Alexander's most effective tactics during this confrontation was his ability to transform the narrative of the mutiny. Instead of defending himself against accusations of having become too Persian or too far removed from his Macedonian origins, he turned the tables and accused his soldiers of ingratitude and treason. He argued that everything he had done, including adopting Persian customs and integrating soldiers of other nationalities, had been done to strengthen the empire and ensure its continuity. But the most dramatic moment of the confrontation came when Alexander decided to call what he perceived as his soldiers' bluff. If they truly believed they no longer needed him, if they truly preferred to return home rather than continue serving under his command, then he would give them exactly what they asked for. With a theatrical gesture that would be remembered for centuries, Alexander announced that all Macedonian soldiers were exempt from service, not just the veterans he had originally planned to send home. This decision shocked both the mutinous soldiers and contemporary observers. Alexander was essentially disbanding the core of his army, the same army that had conquered the known world. He was betting everything on a single psychological gambit, calculating that his soldiers would realize what it would truly mean to lose not only their command, but also their identity as conquerors and members of the most successful army in history. But Alexander didn't stop there. In an even more dramatic demonstration of his determination, he announced that he would continue his campaigns only with Persian and other nationalities. He appointed Persian officers to command positions that had traditionally been held by Macedonians. He began reorganizing his forces as if the Macedonian soldiers no longer existed. The soldiers' reaction to these extreme measures was initially one of disbelief. Many believed Alexander was simply trying to scare them, that he would back down from his threats when he realized he couldn't truly dispense with his entire Macedonian army. But when it became clear that Alexander was serious, that he was truly prepared to continue without them, the dynamics of the mutiny began to change dramatically. That over the next few days, a fascinating psychological transformation began to occur. Among the Macedonian soldiers, at first, many maintained their defiance, insisting that Alexander would soon realize his error and come begging for their return. But as the hours passed, and they saw Alexander actually implementing his threats, the reality of the situation began to set in. The soldiers began to realize that Alexander wasn't bluffing. He truly was willing to sacrifice his relationship with them for the sake of his principles and his vision for the empire. This realization forced many to reconsider not only their specific demands, but the entire nature of their revolt. They had defied Alexander, believing he needed them more than they needed him. But now they faced the very real possibility that they were wrong. The situation became even more complex when Persian and other national soldiers began to respond positively to Alexander's offers. Many of them had served in his auxiliaries for years. Observing how the Macedonians received the best positions and the greatest privileges, now, suddenly they had the opportunity to become the core of Alexander's army, to occupy prestigious positions that had been denied them due to their nationality. This development created an even more disturbing dynamic for the mutinous Macedonian soldiers. They were not only facing the prospect of being discharged, but of being replaced by men they had considered inferior. The possibility that Alexander might actually continue his campaigns without them and potentially achieve even greater success was a humiliation many could not accept. Meanwhile, Alexander continued with his plans as if nothing had happened. He held ceremonies to appoint new Persian officers, began training new units composed entirely of non-Macedonian soldiers, and even planned new military campaigns. Each of these actions was calculated not only to demonstrate his seriousness, but also to increase the psychological pressure on the mutinous soldiers. The genius of Alexander's strategy becomes even more apparent when we consider how it directly attacked his soldiers' deepest fears. They feared not only losing their jobs or their source of income, they feared losing their identity as world conquerors, their special place in history, their legacy as the men who had followed Alexander the Great to the ends of the earth. As the days passed, the cohesion of the mutiny began to disintegrate. Individual soldiers began to privately question whether they had made the right decision. Veteran officers who had initially supported the revolt began to reconsider their positions. Pressure from their families and communities, which depended on the wealth and prestige they gained from their campaigns, also began to weigh on their decisions. The turning point came when a group of veteran soldiers, led by some of the army's most respected officers, decided to break ranks and seek out Alexander directly. These men, who had served with him since the beginning of his campaigns, understood better than anyone both Alexander's value as a leader and the cost of losing him. The meeting between Alexander and these soldiers' representatives was, by all accounts, highly emotional. The veterans came not only to apologize, but to genuinely express their concerns about the changes they had observed in Alexander over the years. They spoke of their unwavering loyalty to him as a person and as a king, but also of their fears that he was distancing himself from his Macedonian origins. Alexander, for his part, demonstrated a facet of his personality rarely seen in public. He listened to his soldiers' concerns. With a combination of understanding and firmness, he explained his decisions not as rejections of his Macedonian heritage, but as necessary evolutions of governing a multicultural empire. He argued that true loyalty to Macedonian traditions meant adapting them to the realities of a world much larger and more complex than the one his ancestors had known. But perhaps the most powerful moment of this meeting came when Alexander allowed himself to show his own emotional vulnerability. He spoke of the loneliness of command, of the weight of making decisions that affected millions of people, of how every choice he made was criticized and questioned by someone. He expressed his own pain at seeing men with whom he had shared so much now doubt his intentions and his loyalty to them. This display of humanity from Alexander had a profound effect on the veterans. Present, they remembered the young prince who had assumed the Macedonian throne at 20, who had dreamed of surpassing the feats of Achilles and other legendary heroes. They saw in him not only the ruthless conqueror he had become, but also the man who bore the weight of impossible expectations and unimaginable responsibilities. The resolution of the Opis mutiny came not through political concessions or strategic compromises, but through a genuinely emotional reconciliation between Alexander and his soldiers. When the veterans returned to their units and recounted their conversation with Alexander, the nature of the entire conflict changed. What had begun as a revolt over specific policies became an opportunity to reaffirm the personal and emotional bonds that had held the army together through so many campaigns. The Macedonian soldiers, one by one, began returning to the ranks, not because their original concerns had been completely resolved, but because they realized that their relationship with Alexander transcended any specific policy. They had shared too many victories, overcome too many impossible challenges, and created too great a legacy to allow differences over military procedure to destroy it all. The official end of the mutiny was marked by a reconciliation ceremony that Alexander personally organized. This was not a typical celebration of military victory, but something much more intimate and meaningful. Alexander publicly acknowledged his soldiers' concerns and promised that, while some changes were necessary for the good of the empire, he would never forget or devalue the contributions of the Macedonians, who had made his conquests possible. But the resolution of the mutiny also included practical elements that demonstrated Alexander's political skill. He modified some of his more controversial plans, agreeing to keep a substantial core of Macedonian soldiers in leadership positions. He also implemented a more gradual integration system for Persian and other nationality soldiers, allowing the Macedonians to adjust to the changes at a more comfortable pace. Most importantly, Alexander used the crisis as an opportunity to reaffirm his vision for the empire, but in a way his soldiers could accept. He argued that the inclusion of Persians and others was not a rejection of the Macedonians, but an extension of their cultural and military superiority. The Persian soldiers were not replacing the Macedonians, but being elevated to the Macedonian standard, thus proving the superiority of the military system they had helped create. The consequences of the Opis mutiny extended far beyond the immediate resolution of the conflict. The crisis forced Alexander to confront some of the contradictions inherent in his vision of empire. He had dreamed of creating a truly cosmopolitan state, but he discovered that even his most loyal followers had limits on how much change they could accept. Experience taught him that political innovation, no matter how visionary, must be balanced with respect for existing traditions and identities. For the Macedonian soldiers, the mutiny was an equally transformative experience. They learned that their relationship with Alexander was more complex and valuable than they had realized. They also discovered that, while they had the power to challenge specific decisions, the alternative of losing Alexander completely was unacceptable. This realization made them more receptive to future changes, but also more aware of their own value within the structure of the empire. The mutiny also had important implications for how Alexander governed for the rest of his life. He became more careful about how he implemented controversial changes, more attentive to the concerns of his subordinates, and more adept at communicating his views in ways that different groups could accept. He never again faced a revolt of the same magnitude, in part because he had learned to anticipate and address concerns before they became crises. The story of the Opis mutiny also offers fascinating insights into the nature of leadership in extreme contexts. Alexander demonstrated that, even for the most charismatic and successful leaders. Loyalty can never be taken for granted. He learned that true power comes not only from the ability to command, but from the ability to inspire followers to willingly choose to follow, even when faced with hardship or uncomfortable change. Furthermore, the mutiny illustrates how cultural and identity tensions can threaten even the most ambitious political endeavors. Alexander's empire was an unprecedented experiment in multicultural integration, but the Opis mutiny showed that this integration could not be imposed by royal decree alone. It required constant negotiation, mutual compromise, and respect for the sensitivities of all groups involved. From a military perspective, the incident demonstrates the fundamental importance of troop morale. In any prolonged military endeavor, Alexander's soldiers did not mutiny because of harsh physical conditions or lack of supplies, problems they had endured for years. They rebelled because they felt their identity and worth were being threatened. This lesson about the importance of psychological and emotional factors in warfare would remain relevant for millennia. Alexander's reaction to the mutiny also reveals interesting aspects of his personality that are often obscured by narratives focused on his military achievements. His decision to confront the mutinous soldiers directly, rather than using intermediaries or making immediate concessions, demonstrates both his personal courage and his instinctive understanding of group psychology. He understood that, in this particular situation, showing weakness or indecision would be more dangerous than risking a direct confrontation. The period immediately following the mutiny's resolution was marked by a series of reforms and policies that reflected the lessons Alexander had learned. He implemented a more structured system for integrating soldiers of different nationalities, creating mixed units, where Macedonians served as officers and trainers for Persian and other nationality recruits. This approach allowed integration to continue, but in a way that preserved the special status of Macedonian soldiers. Alexander also began to pay more attention to his soldiers' domestic concerns. He established a more regular system of leaves and rotations, allowing veterans to visit their families in Macedonia before returning to active duty. He also increased financial support for soldiers' families, recognizing that the troops' loyalty was closely tied to the well-being of their loved ones back home. Perhaps most significantly, Alexander modified his approach to cultural customs and traditions within his army. While he continued to promote integration and the selective adoption of Persian practices, he became more careful about preserving specifically Macedonian rituals and traditions. He organized regular festivals celebrating Macedonian heritage, maintained traditional military ceremonies, and ensured that Macedonian soldiers continued to have opportunities to express their distinctive cultural identity. The experience of the mutiny also profoundly influenced Alexander's decisions about succession and the empire's continuity. He became more aware of the fragile balance he had created between different ethnic and cultural groups within his domain. This awareness led him to invest more time and energy in training the next generation of leaders, both Macedonian and Persian, who could continue his policies of integration after his death. Unfortunately, Alexander's untimely death just 3 years after the Opis mutiny meant that many of these reforms were never fully implemented, but the lessons learned during the crisis continued to influence Alexander's successors, the Diadochi, as they struggled to hold together fragments of his empire. Many of them adopted modified versions of Alexander's integration policies, recognizing that the inclusion of local elites was essential for long-term stability. The story of the Opis mutiny also reminds us of how seemingly minor events can have enormous historical consequences. Had Alexander handled the crisis differently, had he made immediate concessions or used force to suppress the revolt, the course of world history could have been dramatically different. The empire might have fragmented years earlier. The planned campaigns in Arabia would never have been attempted, and the Greco-Persian cultural fusion that characterized the Hellenistic period might never have developed. From the perspective of military history, the Opis mutiny stands out as one of the few recorded examples of a successful revolt, being resolved through psychological and emotional leadership, rather than force or material concessions. Alexander's approach of confronting his soldiers directly risking everything in a single psychological move, and then using the crisis as an opportunity to reaffirm bonds of loyalty, became a model studied by military leaders for centuries. The crisis also illustrates the inherent tensions between innovation and tradition that all transformational leaders face. Alexander was trying to create something genuinely new in the world, a multi-ethnic empire governed by principles of merit rather than ethnic origin. But he discovered that even positive changes can generate resistance when they threaten established identities and familiar hierarchies. The way Alexander balanced these tensions offers valuable lessons for contemporary leaders facing organizational or societal change. His experience suggests that successful innovation requires not only a clear vision of the future, but also a deep respect for the value and contributions of those who made past success possible. Sustainable change comes through persuasion and demonstration of value, not through unilateral imposition. Furthermore, the mutiny demonstrates the importance of effective communication during times of change. The problems that led to the revolt had been growing for months, but Alexander had failed to recognize or adequately address his soldiers' concerns. Only when forced by a crisis did he engage in genuine dialogue about their motivations and visions. This experience taught him that effective leadership requires proactive and ongoing communication, not just during crises. The most fascinating aspect of the Opis mutiny, however, may be how it reveals the complex humanity of both Alexander and his soldiers. Historical narratives often portray ancient leaders as one-dimensional figures, whether as perfect heroes or cruel tyrants. But the Opis crisis shows Alexander as a genuinely human leader, capable of both arrogance and vulnerability, both brilliant vision and errors of judgment. Similarly, the Macedonian soldiers emerge from this story not as obedient puppets or irrational rebels, but as complex men trying to navigate change in a world that was transforming faster than they could comprehend. Their concerns about identity, loyalty, and the future were legitimate and understandable, even when their initial actions were counterproductive. The successful resolution of the mutiny also highlights the crucial role of mutual trust in effective leadership. Despite all the tensions and disagreements, Alexander and his soldiers had built over the years a foundation of shared experiences and mutual respect that proved stronger than their temporary differences. This fundamental trust allowed both sides to engage in honest dialogue and reach a mutually acceptable resolution. In retrospect, the Opis mutiny can be seen as a pivotal moment in the evolution of both Alexander as a leader and his empire as a political institution. The crisis forced both to adapt and evolve in ways that made them more resilient and effective. Alexander learned to better balance innovation with tradition, while his soldiers learned to embrace necessary change without abandoning their essential identity. History also reminds us that even the most successful leaders face moments of existential crisis where everything they've worked for is at risk. How Alexander navigated this crisis, maintaining both his vision and his relationships, offers a valuable model for anyone facing similar leadership challenges. His experience suggests that, in the most difficult moments, the combination of courage, flexibility, and emotional authenticity often proves more effective than sheer power or political manipulation. The legacy of the Opis riot extends far beyond its immediate resolution. It set precedents for how multicultural societies can navigate tensions between different ethnic and cultural groups. It demonstrated that successful integration requires not only well-intentioned policies, but also sensitivity to the concerns and identities of all groups involved. More broadly, history offers insights into the nature of historical and social change. It shows that truly significant transformations rarely occur smoothly or without resistance. Instead, they often involve periods of crisis and conflict that, when skillfully navigated, can lead to stronger and more lasting syntheses between tradition and innovation. The Opis mutiny therefore remains not only a fascinating episode in Alexander's biography, but a valuable case study in leadership, social change, and the complex dynamics between tradition and innovation. To fully understand the lasting significance of this crisis, we must consider how it fits into the broader context of the challenges Alexander faced during his final years. The mutiny was not an isolated event, but part of a series of growing tensions that reflected the inherent difficulties of maintaining such a vast and diverse empire. Alexander was constantly balancing the demands of different ethnic groups, the expectations of various social classes, and the pressures of administering territories that spanned 3 continents. The multicultural nature of Alexander's empire created unique challenges that no previous leader had faced. Unlike previous empires, which often simply subjugated conquered peoples and extracted tribute, Alexander was attempting to create a genuine synthesis between Greek, Macedonian, Persian, Egyptian, and many other cultures. This ambitious vision required not only military conquest, but also political, diplomatic, and social innovation on an unprecedented scale. The initial success of this policy of cultural integration can be seen in many aspects of Alexander's administration. He established cities that blended Greek architecture with local traditions, promoted marriages between Macedonians and women from noble Persian families, and created administrative systems that incorporated the best practices of different governmental traditions. These experiments yielded impressive results in many regions, creating a rich cultural synthesis that would influence the development of civilization. For centuries, however, the Opis mutiny revealed that this integration had its limits, especially when it came to the empire's military core. The Macedonian soldiers, who had been the direct instruments of Alexander's conquests, felt threatened by the possibility that their special status might be diluted. This reaction was understandable, given that their identity as elite warriors was closely tied to their ethnic origins and the specific military traditions they had inherited from previous generations. Resolving the crisis through mutual compromise and improved communication established a model for how complex societies can navigate similar tensions. Alexander demonstrated that effective leadership in multicultural contexts requires not only vision and determination, but also empathy and flexibility. He learned to articulate his vision of integration in ways that different groups could accept, emphasizing how his policies strengthened rather than threatened existing identities. This approach had important ramifications for the empire's long-term stability. In the years following the mutiny, Alexander managed to implement many of his most ambitious reforms without facing significant resistance. He established academies that trained young men of different ethnicities in the same curricula, created festivals that celebrated both local traditions and imperial achievements, and developed an administrative bureaucracy that functioned effectively across linguistic and cultural barriers. More importantly, the experience of the mutiny profoundly influenced how Alexander thought about succession and continuity. He became more aware that his empire could not survive based solely on his personal leadership. Instead, he needed to create institutions and traditions that could function independently of any individual leader. This realization led him to invest considerable time and energy in training the next generation of administrators and military commanders. The implications of this shift in focus can be seen in the policies Alexander implemented during his final years. He established military schools that trained both Macedonian and Persian officers to the same standards, created rotation systems that allowed leaders of different backgrounds to gain experience in various parts of the empire, and developed legal codes that incorporated elements from different legal traditions. These reforms were not merely administrative, but represented a fundamental evolution in Alexander's conception of what his empire should be. He had begun his campaigns with the relatively simple goal of avenging Persian attacks on Greece and establishing Macedonian supremacy. But as his empire grew, his ambitions became far more sophisticated and visionary. He began to view his rule not simply as a military conquest, but as an experiment in creating a new form of human civilization. The Opis mutiny was crucial in this evolution because it forced Alexander to confront the tensions between his universalist ideals and the realities of existing ethnic and cultural identities. The crisis taught him that true integration could not be achieved through unilateral imposition, but only through a process of mutual negotiation and respectful compromise. This lesson had implications that extended far beyond the borders of Alexander's empire. The Hellenistic kingdoms that emerged after his death adopted many of the integration policies he had developed, creating a lasting synthesis between Greek and Eastern traditions that influenced the development of art, philosophy, science, and religion for centuries. Early Christianity, the development of Hellenistic science, and many artistic traditions we still admire today can trace their origins to the experiments in cultural integration that Alexander pioneered. From a political theory perspective, the Opis Mutiny offers valuable insights into the challenges faced by any leader attempting to implement transformational change. Alexander's experience suggests that successful innovation requires not only a clear vision of the desired future but also a deep understanding of the values and concerns of those who must implement the changes. Resistance is not necessarily a sign of ill will or ignorance, but often reflects legitimate concerns that must be addressed through dialogue and compromise. Alexander's approach to conflict resolution also offers valuable lessons. His decision to confront the mutinous soldiers directly, rather than resorting to intermediaries or force, demonstrated his understanding that certain crises require personal and authentic leadership. He understood that, in moments of existential crisis, followers need to see that their leaders are genuinely committed to their principles and willing to risk everything for them. At the same time, Alexander's flexibility after the initial reconciliation demonstrates that effective leadership also requires the ability to learn and adapt. He didn't see the concessions he made as signs of weakness, but rather as opportunities to refine and improve his policies. This combination of principled firmness and flexible implementation proved to be one of the keys to his long-term success. The story of the mutiny also illustrates the importance of narrative and symbolism in political leadership. Alexander understood that the events at Opis were not just about specific policies, but about the broader story of who he was as a leader and what his empire represented. His ability to transform a potentially destructive crisis into an opportunity to reaffirm shared values demonstrated his sophistication as a communicator and myth-maker. That the symbolic dimension of Alexander's leadership had lasting consequences. The story of how he faced and overcame the Opis Mutiny became part of Alexander's legend, contributing to his reputation as a leader who could overcome any challenge. Through a combination of courage, intelligence, and charisma, this reputation, in turn, strengthened his authority and made future crises less likely. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect of the mutiny story is how it reveals the complex psychology of the leadership itself. Alexander was operating under enormous pressures, trying to hold together an empire encompassing tens of millions of people, navigate complex international politics, and implement ambitious social reforms, all while planning future military campaigns. The fact that he could remain effective under such circumstances speaks as much to his psychological resilience as to his tactical and strategic skills. The emotional vulnerability Alexander demonstrated during his reconciliation with the soldiers also offers insights into the human nature of leadership. Even the most charismatic and successful leaders face moments of doubt and isolation. Alexander's ability to recognize and express these vulnerabilities while still maintaining his authority demonstrates an emotional sophistication that is often underestimated in analysis of his leadership. This human dimension of the story also makes the Opis Mutiny relevant to contemporary audiences in ways that many other historical events are not. While few of us face the specific challenges of governing an ancient empire, many can relate to the pressures of leading organizational change, navigating cultural tensions, or balancing innovation with tradition. The strategies Alexander used to resolve these tensions remain relevant and applicable today. The lasting legacy of the Opis Mutiny can also be seen in how the story has been interpreted and reinterpreted over the centuries. Subsequent leaders, from Julius Caesar to Napoleonic generals, studied the episode as an example of how to turn crises into opportunities. Political theorists have used the story to illustrate principles of leadership, negotiation, and change management. Historians continue to debate the lessons that can be learned from the event and its relevance to contemporary challenges. As we draw to a close this exploration of the Opis mutiny, it's worth reflecting on how an event that lasted just a few days over 2,000 years ago continues to offer valuable insights into fundamental questions of human experience. History reminds us that even the most extraordinary leaders face moments of crisis where everything they've worked for is at risk. How they navigate these crises often determines not only their own fate, but the course of history. Alexander the Great faced many challenges during his extraordinary career, but few were as dangerous or revealing as the mutiny of Opis. His response to the crisis demonstrated not only his skills as a military strategist, but also his maturity as a political leader and his depth as a human being. The way he transformed a moment of near disaster into an opportunity for growth and reconciliation continues to inspire and instruct leaders more than 2 millennia later. Ultimately, the story of the Opis mutiny teaches us that true greatness comes not only from external achievements, but from the ability to grow, adapt, and overcome internal challenges. Alexander proved at Opis that he was more than just a brilliant conqueror. He was a leader capable of evolving, learning from mistakes, and finding ways to unite people of diverse backgrounds around shared visions of greatness. This may be his most valuable and lasting lesson for all generations that followed.